Up into week 3 of the story, chapter 3, this morning together. I'm excited about the reading that we've been doing throughout the week as we've read starting in Genesis 2 weeks ago, and then last week we got to talk about the story of Abraham, and today we're jumping into the story of Joseph, which is the last part of Genesis together. I did a quick calculation this week because I was curious how many of these books we've handed out as a church to various people. So if you're new with us today, what we started 3 weeks ago was a 31-week-long sermon series, and you're here on week 3, which is pretty good. But it's really easy to jump into. We're using this book as a tool to help us to understand God's story better. So the story is a chronological version of the Bible that's put together chronologically, along with mixing together of the texts that happened as we read through them. It was put together by Max Lucado and Rondi Frazzi, and we're using it as a jumping off point for our small groups, our Sunday school, and our sermons each week. It doesn't replace the Bible, it just is helping us to understand it in a new light, helping us to understand how the stories fit together in the order that they took place. My calculation I did this week was how many of these books we have handed out so far. And remembering that we're doing it with our Spanish service is following along with the same chapters in the Spanish version of the story. And our teens are doing it as well in Sunday school. And then we have versions that we have here. We've handed out so far 96 copies of the story have gone out to different people, and it's exciting to see how we are engaging with God's story in a new way, in a fresh way, through a simple tool like this. And so I'm looking forward to what continues to happen in the days ahead as well. But today we get to look at chapter 3, which really starts in Genesis chapter 37 and goes on from there. But before we dive into that text, I have a question for you. How many of you have ever rode a roller coaster? Most here have rode a roller coaster of some kind. I have a picture of one here. This is Screamin', California. It's in Disneyland, and it's one of the roller coasters that they have there, actually the biggest one and the fastest one that they have there. And it starts down with the blue little line here, and it rockets you as you begin. And then you go up this tube on the right. And those sound tubes, as I was reading about it, you see where there's kind of a blue circle at the top and a blue circle on the right-hand side that covers part of the track. Those are actually put there so that it minimizes the noise of people screaming to the surrounding community. They're sound dampeners. That's the reason they were put in. But when you ride on Screamin', California, it's just over 4,000 feet long. That beginning part where it starts off, it catapults you from 0 to 55 miles an hour in 4.7 seconds, is how it begins when it starts. And you begin this ride together. I want you to watch a little bit of it here with me. All kinds of people have recorded it, so we get a front row seat to Screamin', California this morning.
And away you go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1!
Okay, so as you're watching this roller coaster go, have any of you ever been on this roller coaster before? Oh, there's a few of us. I've been on it. It's actually quite a fun ride, and all of our kids went on it as well. But when you ride a roller coaster, do you close your eyes, or do you stick your hands up in the air? Full experience. There are some eye closers, there's some hands up in the air people. How about some hold on for dear life people? There's a few of those as well. What kind of rider you are can be true of what is also true in life. Often we talk about life being a roller coaster, similar to this, where there are highs and there are lows, there are ups and there are downs, there are sudden twists and quick turns. There's some loop-de-loops that we'll see where we go all the way around and do a complete circle, and it feels like we're just starting over again as well. Roller coasters are a good analogy for what it's like in life sometimes as well, isn't it? That we have the same thing. Some of us have had days when we've had a really good day, when we've had a lot of fun. It's the hands up in the air kind of day, right? When this is spectacular. And some of us have had days where it's a really bad kind of day, where things have happened that were completely unexpected. Things that are twists and turns that we just don't know what to do, and we hang on for dear life. Close our eyes and hope that it ends soon. How many of you have had a good day when all of a sudden it takes a sudden turn, a sudden twist for the bad? Yeah, there's a few of you out there. I think it's coming to a close now as we come back into the gate. It's a quick ride, but it's 4,000 feet long. I know I've had days where I've had really good days, and then suddenly out of nowhere everything changes, right? Woken up from a sleep with that phone call that no one wants in the middle of the night. At work, when something happens that no one wants to have happen to them. There are days when something suddenly, all of a sudden, goes wrong. There are also days where something suddenly, all of a sudden, goes right. Just like a roller coaster is designed with hills that go up and hills that go down, sudden turns and sudden twists, the same is true of the life that we live in. The same is true for our lives. There are good days and there are bad days. There are days when everything seems to be going our way, and days when we struggle, when things don't seem to be going our way. Days when it seems like we're on the top of the world, and then other days where it feels like the whole world is falling apart and crumbling down around us. Sometimes things seem stable, and sometimes there are days that seem very unstable and unsettling or disturbing. There are many days where we don't know what to expect around the next corner. And in many ways, within the Christian life, I think that it's the goal of the devil to sometimes get our mind dwelling on these things, where we don't know what's going on and we don't know what will happen next, and we begin to question and concern, and we begin to focus on the fear that we have of what may happen. But throughout Scripture, we see that there is a goodness that God has within him that is opposite to the fear that sometimes we experience through life's ups and downs. We want to recognize that when we look at the mountains, when we look at the highs that we have, there are also lows that go along with that. And for every mountain, there is a valley. There is a valley that we go into, and there's a valley that we climb out of. There are mountains that we climb and joys that we experience, and there are also difficult and trying times that we experience as well. We may not understand it right now when we have those lows, but God does. We may not see the obstacle that's coming on the other side of that mountain, but God's already there and he already knows what's coming. We've got to get to a point in our lives where we trust in God that he knows what he's doing and that he is in control. There can be trouble and there can be excitement. There can be joy and there can be sorrow. We all know what that's like in our lives, to ride the roller coaster of life. There's a hymn that we often sing that came to mind as I was thinking about this week. It's a hymn that we have sung many times before. It's an old hymn. It's called "It Is Well With My Soul." The author's name was Horatio Spafford, and some of you will have heard the story behind this. It was written in the mid-1800s, and I want to tell you the story of what happens and why Horatio wrote this song. Horatio Spafford, had known peaceful and happy days as a successful attorney in Chicago. He was the father of 4 daughters and an active member of the Presbyterian Church, and a loyal friend and supporter of D.L. Moody and other evangelical leaders of his day. Then a series of calamities began, starting with the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which wiped out the family's extensive real estate investments. When Mr. Moody and his associates left for Great Britain for an evangelistic campaign, Spafford decided to lift the spirits of his family by taking them on vacation in Europe with him as he went to sing with D.L. Moody and others. In November of 1873, Spafford was detained by urgent business, but he decided to send his wife and 4 daughters, as scheduled, on the SS Villa du Havre, planning to join them soon. But halfway across the Atlantic, the ship was struck by an English vessel and sank within 12 minutes. All four of the Spafford daughters, Tanita, Maggie, Annie, and Bessie, were among the 226 who drowned. Miss Spafford was among the few who were miraculously saved. Horatio stood hour after hour on the deck of a ship carrying him to rejoin his sorrowing wife in Cardiff, Wales. When the ship passed the approximate place where his precious daughters had drowned, Spafford received sustaining comfort from God, which enabled him to write, "When sorrows like sea billows roll, it is well with my soul." When we look at the first verse of this song that he wrote, if you go back to the previous picture, Gavin, this is the original copy of what he wrote as he was traveling across the ship, across the ocean, to join his wife. So his handwritten notes as he wrote out the verses and the chorus to this song. And then the next page is the first verse. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." I honestly can't imagine what I would have done having traveled over the ocean in the spot where my children were lost. I can say I'm not a songwriter. I probably wouldn't have wrote a song. But I trust that God would have been there with me as I travel across that expanse of vast water. When I traveled across the sea, watching the sea billows roll and feeling like I'm drowning in my sorrow. I hope that I would be able to be at a place with God where I could say, "It is well with my soul," even in the midst of one of the darkest lows, the deepest valleys that anyone could experience. When mountains come, valleys also come. When we have great joy, we can also experience deep sorrow. But what a reliance on God he had. What a trust he had that there was something yet to come around the corner, that he didn't know what would happen. Our scripture today tells us of the life of Joseph. He is a big character within the Old Testament, and he actually starts in Genesis 37 and takes us through to the end of the book of Genesis as we read through his story together. But the life of Joseph was very similar to the life that we have lived, the life of living on a roller coaster. All of the ups and downs that we can experience, Joseph experienced them in great degrees as well. Joseph's story starts in Genesis 37 and carries on, as I said, through the rest of the book. But Joseph is the son of Jacob, the grandson of Isaac, and the great-grandson of Abraham, just a few generations removed from when God made a promise to Abraham that his nation would grow like the stars in the sky and that he would bless them and be a blessing to the world through them. Just a few generations later, Joseph comes onto the scene. And I'm sure that he would have been told about this covenant that God had made with his people, because they were living in a new land in Canaan, but they weren't settled yet. He was the 11th of 12 sons that Jacob had, a growing but small tribe. He was the firstborn to Jacob's wife Rachel. And he was young amongst all of the brothers, but he was the favorite amongst all of the brothers, favored by his father, Jacob. And his brothers, as we read through the story, didn't like the attention that he got. The story tells us that Joseph received a fancy ornate robe as a gift from his father. And this robe was the envy of his brothers, and they despised him for receiving this and for having the affection that maybe they desired from their father. And after receiving this robe, Joseph began having dreams, scripture tells us. And these dreams included his brothers being like wheat sheaves around him, 11 wheat sheaves, all bowing before one, which was him. And he told his brothers about this, and that didn't make them too happy. He had another dream where his brothers were like the stars in the sky, and his mother and father were there, like the sun and the moon, and they were all bowing before him. And no one in the family really liked that very much either. He had a rough early life. When he was about 17 years old, his brothers were off taking the flocks to graze in a land far away from them. There was not much where they were, and so as a group, as brothers, they took their flock to go graze. And Jacob, or as he's later known as Israel, as God changed Jacob's name to Israel, he sent his son Joseph to go check on his brothers. And so they saw him coming in his fancy ornate robe, and they came up with a plan. They decided that they would kill him. And then they decided maybe that's a little too harsh. We're going to throw him in this pit, in this cistern, and leave him there to die. And then we are not responsible for him dying. We're just responsible for putting him in that pit. So they stripped off his robe, they threw him into the pit, and as they were sitting there and waiting for whatever they would do next, along came some merchants who were on their way traveling to Egypt. And they had their wares that they were taking with them to sell, and they thought, maybe we don't let him die, but maybe we sell him. We can make a little money off of our brother. We can sell him as a slave and sell him to this merchant, and he will take him off. And so that's what they did. They sold him to the merchants, and they sold him into slavery. As these traders headed to Egypt, they took the brother out of the cistern and took him with them. The brothers, however, took his fancy ornate robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the goat's blood, and took it back to their father, telling him that a wild animal had taken Joseph's life and that he was dead. It was extremely hard on his father, on Jacob, because he was the favored son. But the family, the brothers, were done with this love that their father had for this son. It's a rough life sometimes that we live, isn't it? Joseph had a rough life. How many of you have ever been pushed aside by family? You don't need to raise your hands, but I know you're not alone in that. How many of you feel like you have never been heard, or that life has been tough, or it has been harder on you than it has been on others? I know that that's part of what we have experienced, what you have experienced. How many of you have ever wanted to throw your sibling in a pit and sell them into slavery? Again, don't answer that. But some of us may be in that category too, right? Where we're at our wit's end and we don't know what to do, what to say, and we just want to get it over with. Even God's people had their struggles. Even God's chosen people had their struggles, right? This was the nation that the whole world was to be blessed through. And they were only a few generations in with 12 brothers. It had started gaining some momentum, but still had a long way to go. And this nation, they had their fights. They had their fights to the point of selling a brother into slavery, that they despised him so much. You know, I'm sure that these brothers had heard the story of how God came to their great-grandfather. Oh, he had led them to this faraway land and told them that one day this land would be theirs, but not quite yet. I'm sure they heard the story of Isaac, their grandfather, of Jacob, their father. I'm sure they heard the story of how their father had wrestled with God one night, and God changed his name to Israel, meaning strives with God. And now Joseph himself was having dreams. This little brother was dreaming that one day he would be a ruler over the rest of his family. And Joseph had dreams of greatness, dreams of prominence, but life didn't end up that way. It took a turn for the worse, and at the height of his ride, just as he was moving towards adulthood, things took a turn for the worse, and they took a downward turn fast, being stripped of his robe, cast into a pit, and sold as a slave, being dragged off into a far-off land, far away from his family, far away from the promises God had made to them. We're going to look at Genesis chapter 39 this morning. If you want to turn with me, we're going to read it in just a little bit. If you have the book, if you have your storybook with you, it starts on page 31. But Joseph, having these dreams of greatness, these dreams of prominence, I'm sure he wondered what was going on in his life as he was being dragged, likely in chains, down to Egypt. and as he found himself a slave in Egypt. One thing we need to remember is that our disappointment doesn't justify disobedience. Our disappointment does not justify disobedience. See, it would have been easy for Joseph to justify disobedience at this time. He could have fought against God and what God was doing in his life. He could have demanded something different. But we're going to find in his story as we read it that he remained faithful to God, even though he didn't know what was happening or how this was going to fit into God's plan. He had gone from being the favored son, the pride of his father, part of a growing nation called by God, to being rejected by his brothers, sold into slavery, and made a slave in Egypt, far from home. In his story, things start to go okay as a slave in the house where he is sold to, and he is given authority and he becomes well respected. But then things take a turn for the worse again, and he's thrown into prison again. But we want to remember that justice or disappointment does not justify disobedience. It would have been easy for him to give up and stop trying. It would have been easy for him to give in to the seductions that were before him or into the fame and power that he would receive. But he never lost sight of what God had given him, the visions that he had given him. Sometimes I think we would be like Joseph and we would wonder in those times, where is God in the midst of our disappointment? Have you ever wondered that? Where is God in the midst of this? I have. And I bet Joseph did. I bet Horatio Spafford did as he wrote that song, "It Is Well With My Soul." I bet Jacob wondered what was going on. I bet his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham wondered as he cried out to God at 99 years old, "Where is this child you have promised me going to come from?" Joseph dreamt of playing a part in God's story, but was sold as a slave and thrown into prison. But he kept trying to do the right thing. Let's read Genesis chapter 39. We're going to read verses 1 to 6 together. I'm going to read off the screen with you this morning. So Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 to 6. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything that he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Then a few verses later, in verse 23 of chapter 39, it says, the warden paid no attention. This is after he was thrown in prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. See, Joseph's story goes from being cast into a pit and sold by his brothers to being dragged as a slave down to Egypt and sold to Potiphar's household. But he remained faithful. He remained consistent to what God had asked him to do. As Potiphar's household began to flourish because of God's blessing and God's hand upon Joseph, he became in charge of everything, the second in charge of everything that happened in Potiphar's house and on his field. And it came to the point where even Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him and tried to throw herself before him, is what the text tells us. And Joseph actually says, this is not what God would want me to do. And he left his robe that she was clinging on to behind and ran out of the room, leaving behind that temptation. And for that, Potiphar's wife accused him of trying to assault her. And he was then cast out of the house and cast into prison. Once again, going from a great height to a great low, from a high to a place where he was cast back into a prison in Egypt. And then he went through a phase where he began to help those that were in prison, began to help them interpret dreams. And eventually his story begins to rise once again. After several years in prison, he gets called before the Pharaoh to help interpret dreams, and the story begins to rise. The Pharaoh takes him in, and he once again becomes in charge of not just Potiphar's household, but in charge of all of Egypt, second in command to the Pharaoh himself, because of the dreams and visions that God helped him to interpret. These words are key, though. Through all of the highs and in the lows, those times when we have wondered where God is, when Joseph had wondered where God is, he was right there with him. The Lord was with Joseph. God helped Joseph during the low points, and he helped him during the high points. God was at work in the difficult times, and he was using them for his glory and for his purposes. God had helped him to interpret the dreams. God gave him that ability, and that eventually got him out of prison and into that position of prominence within the Egyptian government. And eventually, these dreams began to come true. When we read through the story, we see that there was a great famine in the land, and that one of Joseph's dreams had prophesied would come. One of the Pharaoh's dreams had prophesied would come. That there would be 7 years of great wealth and great resources coming in from their crops, but followed by 7 years of hardship and famine. And so Joseph stored up during the 7 full years and saved them for the years when they would be empty and longing for food. And it was during that time that Joseph's brothers came down from Canaan to Egypt to look for food, because they heard that Egypt still had food, and so they took money down to trade for food so that their family would not starve. And that's where Joseph sees his dream come true. As he stood there with his brothers not recognizing him as they bowed before him, his dream from decades earlier came true. Those brothers eventually went back, as the story reads, and brought back his father with him, and his father again bows before him. And they live in the land of Egypt for a number of generations to follow, and they flourish and grow into a huge nation because of what God did through Joseph. We are often in such a hurry that we miss seeing God in the moment. I think at any point in Joseph's story, if that was me, I could have given up, right? If I was sold into slavery, if I was thrown into prison, if I had all of these different things happen to me, rejected by my family, I would think that the story was over. But he remained faithful, and God remained faithful to him. And sometimes we miss that. We're in such a hurry that we miss seeing what God is doing in the moment while it is happening. When we think of these stories, we think of the upper story. We think of that story that is above everything else that's happening in Scripture, the story where God is weaving his narrative throughout that narrative, throughout that story. In the upper story, we see great things happening in the nation of Israel. God had promised to Abraham that he would build a nation, that he would build a great nation through him. He had one son, who in turn had a couple of sons, who in turn, Jacob had the 12 that we read about, Joseph being one of them. And Joseph's story is weaved into this upper story of God's grand narrative, that there are great things going to happen in Joseph's life and in the life of God's chosen nation, because God had a plan that wasn't revealed to Joseph at the time, that there was something great that was going to happen during this time, and Joseph was preparing for that. God was preparing for that. In the lower story, there's a roller coaster ride of highs and lows. And we see that in Joseph's story, because his story is one of great highs and one of great lows. Just like Horatio Spafford in writing the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul, his life was full of great highs and full of deep, deep lows. And just like in our stories, in my story, life doesn't often go as we had it planned. Life doesn't often go as we would expect. But we need to remember that God gets the last word. All of us start off by thinking our story will be written in a certain way, but it never quite goes the way that we had planned, does it? But God gets the last word. He knows what's around that corner. He knows what's over that hill. He knows what's happening in that valley. You know, we don't get to choose our own adventure. We don't get to know the challenges that will come. We don't know what suffering we will see or what hurts we will have to handle. But we know that God is working in all things, and in all things he's working together for his good, for his upper story. And our story somehow fits into that grand design in ways that he has designed that we may not understand in the moment. What we do know is how the story ends, that ultimately our hope is one in which we trust in God and trust in the world, the place that he has promised for us, where all things will be returned to the way he originally intended them to be, where all things will be good. The journey between now and then is still full of twists and turns, full of ups and downs, but we travel that road together, and we travel it with God, knowing that he has control of where the end of this roller coaster ride finishes. Right now, the words in your mind might be filled with disappointment or divorce or fired or abused. But you need to remember that God gets the last word, that he is still there, and that he gets the last word. Just like he was with Joseph, he is with you today. We have a song that they're going to sing for you this morning. And as they're singing it, I just want you to remember that it's true. God gets the last word. In your life, in my life, he gets the last word.
It is well. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. Won't you stand and sing this great hymn with us? When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul, with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul.
One of the great privileges we get out of being here this morning is that our stories weave together, don't they? That your story and my story have woven together and become part of God's great grand story, his narrative. That is what he's called us to do. So through life's ups and downs, we're not alone. Not only is he there with us, we're there with each other. We have one another. As we go today, may you go understanding the great privilege you have as being part of his family, be part of this family. May you understand that through the highs and lows, he is there with you. He's there beside you. He's there carrying you. He's there lifting you up. And that even though we may feel like we're alone, we are never alone. We have him, he has us, and we have each other too. So may God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you this week, and may you experience his great presence in the week ahead. God bless, and have a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving weekend.